In calendar number 106, H.R. 884, a bill to prohibit individuals who are not citizens of the United States from voting in elections in the District of Columbia and to repeal the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2022.
Pursuant to House Resolution 489, the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, printed in the bill, is adopted, and the bill as amendment is considered read. The bill as amended shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking member of the Committee of Oversight and Government Reform or their respective designees. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, and the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Frost, each will control 30 minutes, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the measure under consideration.
Without objection.
Madam Chair, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of H.R. 884, which prohibits individuals who are not citizens of the United States from voting in elections in the District of Columbia. On November 21st, 2022, the D.C. government enacted the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act, permitting non-citizen residents to vote in D.C. local elections. This includes illegal immigrants and even foreign diplomats whose interests may be opposed to the interests of Americans. This radical change to Washington, D.C.'s election laws upset lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. For instance, Washington, D.C. Mayor Bowser withheld her signature on the act, something she has done only a handful of times. In last Congress, when an identical bill was brought to the floor, 262 members voted in favor, including 52 of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Unfortunately, the Senate refused to take up this bipartisan, common sense bill to maintain election integrity in our nation's capital. The right to vote is a defining privilege of American citizenship. Diluting that right by extending it to non-citizens, whether here legally or illegally, undermines the voice of Washington, D.C. residents. Article 1 of the Constitution grants Congress exclusive jurisdiction over the nation's capital, and the House Oversight Committee is charged with ensuring responsible governance in the district, including its election laws. I urge my colleagues to support Representative August Pfluger's bill to restore common sense protections and ensure that only United States citizens have the right to vote in local D.C. elections. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves, and the gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you. I yield myself as much time as I consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I strongly oppose H.R. 884, which would repeal a law duly enacted by the District of Columbia because D.C. should be free to govern its own local matters. Republicans claim that Congress has a constitutional duty to legislate on local D.C. matters, but this is historically and legally incorrect. Republicans legislate on local D.C. matters only when they think they can score political points, such as by demonizing immigrants. Where is this passion and work on affordable housing for D.C. residents? Where is this impassioned work on ending gun violence for D.C. residents? They only bring it up to the floor when they think they can score political points, taking away the democratic rights of people here in D.C. and home rule. The framers expected Congress to establish a local government for D.C., and Congress has established various forms of local government for D.C. since 1802. The Supreme Court has held that Congress may delegate to D.C. legislative authority over local D.C. matters. In 1973, Congress passed the D.C. Home Rule Act, which gave D.C. an elected chief executive and an elected legislature, the mayor and the D.C. City Council. The purpose of the Home Rule Act is to, quote, grant the inhabitants of the District of Columbia powers of local self-government, and, quote, to relieve Congress of the burden of legislating upon essentially local D.C. matters, end quote. H.R. 884 contravenes the purpose of the Home Rule Act. D.C.'s Local Residents Voting Amendment Act of 2022 allows D.C. residents who are not yet U.S. citizens to vote only in local elections. only in local elections, namely for mayor, members of the city council, the state board of education, attorney general, advisory neighborhood commissioner, and ballot measures. The D.C. law does not allow non-citizens to vote in federal elections, which is a crime under federal law. Regardless of your views on the merits of non-citizen voting for local elections, we have to acknowledge that D.C. is not the first, nor are they the only jurisdiction in our country to allow this. At various points throughout American history, Congress in 40 states have allowed non-citizens to vote in local, state, territorial elections, including the home state of the sponsor of this bill. Congress did not prohibit non-citizens from voting in federal elections until 1996. And today, about 20 municipalities allow non-citizens to vote in local elections. I also want to address very specific concerns that we're hearing from our Republican colleagues. Number one, they're concerned that foreign diplomats might vote in local D.C. elections. We believe, number one, that that's highly unlikely, both because they have to renounce their right to vote in their home country and because D.C. has no authority over federal matters and has only limited local self-government. In D.C., the penalty for voter fraud includes imprisonment for up to 5 years. To be eligible to vote in D.C., a person must maintain their residency in D.C. for at least 30 days before the election and cannot claim voting residence or the right to vote in any state, territory, or country. In a letter to Congress, the D.C. Board of Elections made it clear that to vote in a D.C. local election, a foreign diplomat would have to, quote, effectively renounce their right to vote in their country of origin, end quote. The board noted that a foreign diplomat would have to, quote, swear under penalty of law through the D.C. registration application that the person is not claiming voting residence in another country, end quote. The board also noted that an embassy address cannot be used to register to vote, since it is considered a commercial or business address, and a foreign passport cannot be used to register to vote since it does not contain a residential address in D.C. While Republicans are concerned about foreign diplomats voting in local elections, I wonder if they're aware that the United States, that currently in this country, United States citizens who are registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act are currently allowed to vote in elections at all levels of government in the United States, including federal elections. That's right. Registered foreign agents who are currently U.S. citizens can vote anywhere in the United States. Republicans are also concerned that undocumented immigrants might vote in local D.C. elections. That's highly unlikely because the D.C. voter roll is public record, and undocumented immigrants likely would not want to identify themselves, including their address. In closing, the House of Representatives is considering the wrong D.C. voting rights bill here today. Republicans claim that voting is a core right or the privilege of American citizenship. And not only is that historically incorrect, but I described earlier, it's also hypocritical. Republicans have fought tooth and nail to defeat legislation that would give the American citizens who reside in D.C. voting representation in the House and the Senate. We, of course, continue to push for D.C. statehood, and I urge the House to reject H.R. 884 and instead to pass H.R. 51. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves, and the gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the sponsor of the bill, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the chair, Mr. Comer, my good friend from Kentucky. I rise in support of my bill, H.R. 884, that would prohibit individuals who are not citizens of the United States from voting in elections in the District of Columbia. This is a common sense bill. I'm going to start with the question that's posed. Why, for what reasons, why would my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want foreigners to vote in local elections in Washington, D.C.? What's the purpose? So let's just pose that question of why, and I ask the American public to ask your representative where they stand on this issue, because it's a bipartisan issue, with over two-thirds of this body having voted for it last year. Free and fair elections are a prerequisite for the healthy republic that our founding fathers envisioned in the District of Columbia as the epicenter, and they entrusted its care to Congress in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the U.S. Constitution. On November 21st, 2022, the D.C. City Council made a radical decision to allow non-citizens, including illegal aliens and those who are aligned with embassies of foreign countries, to vote in local D.C. elections. After the non-citizen voting law went into effect, the district actively encouraged non-citizens to vote for mayor, attorney general, members of the State Board of Education, and more. And some may wrongly dismiss these as merely local elections. However, the reality is that local elections are a vital part to our democratic process and have a significant impact on communities. Local elections determine critical matters such as taxation, the criminal code, and the election of city council members who create essential ordinances, including those that dictate voting rights. It's also important to acknowledge that many local elections are decided by razor-thin margins, underscoring their significance and the importance of active participation. And I find it unimaginable that the district, along with many across the country, would intentionally weaken the power of their constituents, citizens, many of whom come from underserved communities, in favor of non-citizens who in some cases have broken our laws to enter this country or could potentially be employed by a foreign adversary. As the capital of our democracy, Washington, D.C. should be at the forefront of ensuring safe and secure elections, not encouraging illegal immigrants and others to vote for policies that we don't want. And I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to look beyond Democrats' claim that this bill is discriminatory or misrepresents its intended purposes. No, it doesn't. It absolutely does not. This keeps the sanctity of being a citizen of this great country at the highest possible level. And let's restore that sanctity. And I go back to the question. This is common sense. But you have to ask yourself, why would you want a foreign agent? Why would you want an illegal immigrant? Why would you want somebody else that's not a citizen voting in local elections in D.C.? For what nefarious purpose are you pushing? As I mentioned, last Congress, the House passed this bill with bipartisan support. All Republicans and 1/3 of Democrats supported this common sense measure, and I'm asking everybody in the House of Representatives to stand up and do the right thing. Vote for this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman reserves, and the gentleman from Florida is recognized.
You know, it's interesting because the gentleman just asked our constituents to ask us what we think about this issue, but I think the better thing would be for the gentleman to ask his constituents what they care about. And I promise you, this issue will not be in the top 3 nor 10 of the things that they want us to focus on. And at the same time, they're pushing a bill to take away health care from 15 million Americans. Give me a damn break. D.C. believes in universal adult suffrage, that all adult D.C. residents, regardless of their immigration status, are subject to D.C. laws, taxation, and must register for selective service. D.C. believes they deserve a say in the local laws that govern them and how their local taxes are spent. Congress should not decide which residents are fit to govern on local D.C. matters. And I promise the gentleman, if he spoke with his own constituents, they don't give a damn. I yield 7 minutes to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton.
Say it again. He is recognized.
Thank you. I strongly oppose this undemocratic paternalistic bill, which would repeal a law enacted by the locally elected District of Columbia government and impose a new law on D.C. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from every member of D.C.'s locally elected legislature, the council, opposing this bill. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter D.C.'s locally elected Attorney General, Brian Schwab, opposing this bill.
Without objection.
Last Congress, Republicans introduced 26 bills or amendments to change local D.C. election laws, including 14 to prohibit non-citizens from voting in D.C. or to repeal, nullify, or prohibit the carrying out of the local D.C. law that allows non-citizens to vote in local elections. Yet Republicans refuse to make the only election law change D.C. has requested, which is to make D.C. a state so they can hold elections for voting members of the House and Senate. While Congress has the authority to legislate on local D.C. matters, it is not required to do so. In Federalist 43, James Madison said of D.C. residents, quote, "A municipal legislature for local purposes derived of their own suffrages will, of course, be allowed them," end quote. In 1953, the Supreme Court held that, quote, "There is no constitutional barrier to the delegation by Congress to the District of Columbia to full legislative power," close quote. I want to discuss democracy or lack thereof in D.C. There are 700,000 D.C. residents. D.C. residents are required to pay federal taxes, register with Selective Service, and serve on federal juries in the same manner as residents of states. Yet D.C. residents have no voting representation in Congress, and Congress has the ultimate say on local D.C. matters. The Council has 13 members. If D.C. residents do not like how the members vote, residents can vote them out of office or pass a ballot measure. That is called democracy. Congress has 535 voting members. None are elected by D.C. residents. If D.C. residents do not like how the members vote on local D.C. matters, residents cannot vote them out of office or pass a ballot measure. That is the antithesis of democracy. The substance of this bill is irrelevant, since there is never any jurisdiction for Congress to legislate on local D.C. matters. However, I will briefly discuss it. D.C. allows non-citizens to vote in local elections because it believes that all adult residents deserve a say in their local government. While D.C. law allows non-citizens to vote only in local elections, 40 states and the federal government allow non-citizens to vote in local, state, territorial, and federal elections at various points, including the founding. The federal government first prohibited non-citizens from voting in federal elections only 29 years ago. Today, nearly 20 citizens allow non-citizens to vote in local elections. As the House has considered this bill, Republicans have repeatedly said the franchise is a right of citizenship. If that is what Republicans believe, I hope they will finally grant American citizens who live in D.C. the right to vote for voting representation in Congress. I have introduced H.R. 51 to do so. Pursuant to the admissions and district clauses of the Constitution, H.R. 51 would admit the residential and commercial areas of D.C. as a new state. Statehood would not only give D.C. voting representation in Congress, it would also give D.C. full local self-government. I urge members to respect the will of D.C. residents by voting no on H.R. 884. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves.
Yes, we reserve.
And the gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Malatakis.
The little gentlelady from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to ask the question, why are the Democrats so obsessed with allowing non-citizens to vote in our election? Why do they go so out of their way to dilute the voices of American citizens, the very American citizens who elected them to represent them? It is incredibly frustrating to hear that they continue to double down, triple down on giving rights to people who are not citizens of this country at taxpayer American citizen expense. The lead debater on the other side of the aisle said that it's not just this Washington, D.C. that is looking to allow non-citizens to vote in our elections. 20 municipalities, and guess what? They're all Democrat-run. Now, in New York City, we had the same problem, where the New York City Council passed legislation to allow non-citizens to vote in municipal elections. We had to sue to stop it, and we successfully did. But it took not just one round in court, not just 2 rounds in court, 3 rounds in court, where the City Council and the Mayor of New York used taxpayer money to continue to fight this each and every round, despite being voted down in the New York State Supreme Court, in the New York State Court of Appeals, Appellate Court, and lastly, in the New York Court of Appeals, which, by the way, all Democrat appointees on that panel of judges, and we still won because it is illegal. It is not constitutional for non-citizens to vote in our elections. And so just like we fought this in New York City and we prevailed, we will do the same here in Washington, D.C., and make sure that they stop allowing and they don't allow non-citizens to vote in their municipal elections, because we are exercising our constitutional responsibility to protect our elections. So I urge my colleagues to continue to be strong and vote in support of this, because we know that it passed overwhelmingly with bipartisan support last year. 52 Democrats sided with Republicans. But those who continue to push for non-citizens to vote in our elections, to dilute citizenship and dilute the voice of citizens in our elections, should be ashamed of themselves, and they should think about who actually elected them to represent their interests here today and why they continue to push the contrary. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves, and the gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you. I yield as much time as I might consume. I think it's interesting.
The gentleman is recognized.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I think it's interesting because the gentlelady who just spoke said something. She said this is about preserving our elections, quote, our elections. This is not about our elections. It's not about my election. It's not about her election being from New York. It's about the elections, the local elections of residents of D.C. Not hers, not mine, theirs. Their local election. And I think it's interesting because I don't know what happened. My Republican colleagues always like to talk about limited federal government. My Republican colleagues like to always talk about giving or local governance, how important that is, and yet they want to rip it away from the people in this city. My question is, how many doors have they knocked in D.C.? Have you knocked a single door? Have you spoken with a single resident, a person who lives here, about what they care about? No. You're using this chamber, you're using these bills to score national political points on local issues. The other thing the gentlelady said, is this about protecting the sanity of citizen voting. And like every other issue, Republicans want our people to believe that in order to protect us, we have to take something away from somebody else. That's how we protect the sanity of voting for citizens. We have to take something away from D.C. that they voted for. When right in front of us, if you want to protect the sanctity of citizen voting in D.C., then we know what we have to do. D.C. statehood. We have to ensure that citizens in D.C. are able to have a fully voting representative in the United States Congress, have full representation in this country. That's what we do to protect the sanctity of citizen voting in Washington, D.C. Not encroach on decisions that the people here have made locally. So I don't want to hear about our elections. Local D.C. elections are not my elections. They're not your elections unless you live here. The local D.C. elections are about the residents of this area. Thank you. I yield back, or I reserve.
The gentleman reserved. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gill.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to Democrats trying to give voting rights to illegal aliens. Mr. Speaker, once again, Democrats are taking the 20% side on another 80-20 issue. The American people do not want illegal aliens voting. They shouldn't be here to begin with. They have no claim on our resources, and they certainly should not be influencing our political system in any respect. Mr. Speaker, every single one of them needs to be deported, and thankfully we have a president who is actually doing that. Mr. Speaker, for so long, Democrats have called conservatives conspiracy theorists. They've slandered us for saying that the Democrat playbook, which they themselves have articulated, is to open up our borders to ultimately provide amnesty, a path to citizenship, and voting rights to illegal aliens. And Mr. Speaker, they are doing that right now. That's exactly what they're doing, and they're fighting for it. Allowing illegal aliens to vote is not only grotesquely unjust, but it waters down the meaning of citizenship for American citizens who are here. Mr. Speaker, our government should represent our people, American citizens. Illegal aliens have no right to vote. They shouldn't be voting, and they need to be deported. With that said, I yield back. Thank you.
I think I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
You're recognized.
Well, once again, my Republican colleagues want to deflect on this issue, focus in on undocumented immigrants. Undocumented immigrants are unlikely to vote in local D.C. elections. Again, why? Because the D.C. voter roll is public record. Undocumented immigrants are not going to want to identify themselves, including their address, where they live. Non-citizen voting, again, this is consistent. A lot of jurisdictions across the entire country. We talked about 20 municipalities. Do this to allow universal adult suffrage, the ability for people to take part in local elections. The other thing, real quick, that one of my Republican colleagues brought up is the purpose of this bill is, quote, we want to stop the diluting the voices of American citizens. Diluting the voices of American citizens. What's really diluting the voices of American citizens are voter suppression laws, like we see in the South, like we see in Florida, where I'm from. Poll taxes, voter roll purges, voter intimidation. That is what's diluting the voices of American citizens. I haven't heard a single Republican in this debate talk about ensuring that citizens that live in D.C. can have full representation in Congress. Where's that? I bring it up again. Every issue, Republicans want to talk about protecting us by taking away stuff from other people and never want to talk about giving citizens what we deserve. And the citizens of D.C. deserve to have full representation in the United States Congress. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time remains?
The gentleman from Kentucky has 20.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I yield 10 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the chairman. I thank the chairman for his good work. I thank my colleague August Pfluger for bringing forward today's legislation. U.S. elections should be for U.S. citizens only. A simple premise. When I began my work on trying to stop non-citizens from voting in the United States, I was often told by people that they didn't believe that this was actually the case. That's how radical of a provision exists in Washington, D.C. law. Let's set the stage for folks listening today. Let's set the stage to understand how radical this provision is in Washington, D.C. To be eligible to vote in municipal elections in our nation's capital, an individual only has to reside in Washington, D.C. for 30 days. So let's walk through that. So an individual who works at the Russian embassy, holding a Russian passport in their pocket, residing in the United States capital of Washington, D.C., for simply 30 days, could walk out of the embassy, walk to a polling location, because Washington, D.C. does not even have photo ID, would not need to pull out their Russian passport out of their pocket, and would be eligible to vote for mayor in our nation's capital. What the Democrats want to do, Mr. Speaker, is use Washington, D.C. as a petri dish for liberalizing voting laws across the country. What my Democratic friends want to do, Mr. Speaker, is allow non-citizens to vote across the country. The arguments that are being made fail on the merits when you recognize that the law, in fact, the law today allows non-citizens who simply resided in the nation's capital for 30 days to be eligible to vote. Again, individuals working at embassies across this city are eligible to vote for positions like mayor, alderman. That is the height of hypocrisy. We need to make sure that U.S. elections are for U.S. citizens only. In our nation's capital, we should be looking at a whole host of election law reforms. In fact, I'm of the belief that we should make Washington, D.C. the gold standard of election laws, to actually show the American people what happens when we put in place provisions with strong election integrity. My colleague across the aisle referenced legislation that Republicans are working for. Well, let's take an example and let's dig into that for a moment. Let's look at the election integrity law that was passed in the state of Georgia. This, if we recall, in 2021 was a law that then President Joe Biden called Jim Crow 2.0. In fact, the stories that were told about that legislation earned him, I think, 4 Pinocchios or whatever they call that in the Washington Post. This is how ridiculous it was. Corporate America bought into the misstatements and the falsities of President Biden. If we recall, Major League Baseball removed the All-Star game out of Atlanta, Georgia, following Georgia passing this piece of legislation. Well, of course, 2 elections have passed since that legislation went into effect, so we should look at the empirical data, not at the statements that were made, the hyperbolic statements that were made by my colleagues on the left. We should look at the empirical data of what took place when those reforms were implemented. And what we saw was people increasing their confidence in our elections. That is a good thing. That is a good thing. And the University of Georgia, Georgia State, put forward a robust survey of how elections were conducted in the state of Georgia. And what they saw was high voter participation and people actually having a positive view of how election results were conducted. If I recall correctly, there was 0% statistically of blacks that had a poor or negative voting experience. We should champion that. We should work to instill election integrity provisions across the board. Because when people increase their confidence in our elections, they're more likely to participate. And that's a good thing. What we want is U.S. citizens participating in our election. But what we see from my colleagues on the left is a whole host of policies that actually weaken election integrity. We've held debates as it relates to photo identification. Again, another provision that should be in Washington, D.C. law. Photo identification is almost the rock stone of what is election integrity. It's making sure people are who they say they are, a simple provision. I'm often reminded of a time when I was driving home in Wisconsin, heading back home, and I walked in to grab a 6-pack of beer. The clerk recognized me and said, "Hey, Brian, how you doing?" I said, it's good to see you." I set my 6-pack of beer on the counter, and she said, "Brian, I need to see your ID." So just like every American, what did I do? I reached in, I grabbed my wallet, I pulled out my ID, and I handed it over to the clerk. In my opinion, I think it's absolutely nuts that we protect our beer more than we protect our ballots in our nation's capital. We should be looking at ways to strengthen election integrity here in our nation's capital, the front door for many folks to the greatest country in the world. Instead of fighting back and saying, yes, in our nation's capital, that, as the Democrats will say, that we should allow non-citizens to be voting in our nation's elections, we should actually be saying, no, let's use Washington, D.C. as the gold standard of election integrity. And what I believe we will see is exactly what we saw in Georgia. Despite the hyperbolic statements being made by past President Joe Biden, by my colleagues on the left, what we'll actually see is an increase in confidence in our elections. We'll see growing participation. We'll see a strengthening of our democracy. It's why this legislation is such an important step forward in the process of strengthening the integrity of our elections, increasing Americans' confidence, and garnering additional voter participation across the country. I think it's relevant to also note that last Congress, this bill came before us. 52 of our Democratic colleagues voted with every Republican in the House. It'll be interesting today, Mr. Speaker, to see how many of my colleagues across the aisle have the courage to stand up and to say U.S. elections should be for U.S. citizens only. The big difference here is now we have an opportunity to see this legislation move forward in the United States Senate. This is a bill that could actually be signed into law. We have an opportunity for the first time in a number of years to not only pass election integrity legislation here in the United States House of Representatives, we have an opportunity to pass election integrity legislation into law. Let me tell you, I'm excited about the opportunity to stand there when President Trump signs this bill into law, because this is an opportunity for a major step forward in election integrity here in our nation's capital, but also a statement across the country. Because as I believe, the radical Democrats want to use Washington, D.C. voting laws as a petri dish to roll out their plan across the country. My colleagues on the radical left would like to see non-citizens voting in my home state of Wisconsin, in small communities, big communities, all across this country, to drive forward and assist them in advancing a radical agenda. It's why making sure that we pass this law today is so important. To make sure that we're standing up for common sense, to make sure we're standing up for election integrity, to make sure that we're making only U.S. citizens having a voice in U.S. elections. This legislation should be straightforward to my colleagues on the left, although I'm afraid it won't be. I am proud to know that I believe every Republican who votes today will vote yes on this important measure, because it's the Republican Party, it's my colleagues of common sense, that believe we need election integrity in our nation's capital. But more importantly, we need election integrity across the country. And as we begin this effort, I think we have an opportunity as Americans to see increased confidence in our elections. And once again, when we increase confidence, we increase participation. Our principle should be U.S. elections are for U.S. citizens only. This legislation does that, and I encourage my colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the President of the United States. Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Secretary.
I am directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If the esteemed chair from Wisconsin would indulge me, he brought up a set of laws in Georgia, which I thought was very interesting, talking about what we need to do. But I would yield 30 seconds to the chair if he could let me know who voted for those laws that were enacted in Georgia. I yield 30 seconds to the chair.
It was signed into law.
Gentleman's recognized. Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Signed into law in the state of Georgia by the governor of the state of Georgia.
But I guess my question is, what legislation? Oh, sorry, I reclaim my time. I guess I'm just curious, what body wrote the legislation, voted on the legislation, and sent it to the governor's desk? I yield 30 seconds to the chair.
The gentleman's recognized.
I assume the Assembly and Senate of the state of Georgia prior to signature by the governor of the state
of Georgia. Thank you. I reclaim my time. And the reason I asked the gentleman is he brings up a law in Georgia that was written by the elected representatives of the legislature, voted into office by the people of Georgia. See, my Republican colleagues would have us believe that today a lot of Democrats are going to vote for a bill to give non-citizens the ability to vote in D.C. That's not what we're voting on. We're not voting on a bill to do something. We're voting on a bill to allow something to stay in place, which was voted into action by the elected representatives of the local government of D.C. That's what we're doing here today. We're not voting to give non-citizens the ability to vote. We're just saying, let D.C. make their own local laws, just like they did in Georgia, just like the esteemed chair brought up earlier. And the other thing I want to bring up that was brought up has to do with the length of residency to vote. D.C.'s length of residency requirement is not a unique thing. To vote in D.C., yes, a person has to be a resident for at least 30 days before an election. But to vote in Kentucky, for example, a person has to be a resident for at least 28 days. I haven't heard our esteemed chair of oversight complain about the laws in Kentucky. In fact, under the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, states cannot set a voter registration deadline for federal elections more than 30 days before an election. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Reserve.
Excuse me?
Reserve.
Okay. The gentleman reserves.
Prepare to close.
Okay. The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized. Oh, wait, sorry. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Well, thank you. Like we mentioned here today, no matter what my Republican colleagues say, they want to frame this as the Democrats voting to do something here today. We're not voting to let non-citizens vote in D.C. today. What we're voting to do is allow D.C. to make their own decisions, something my Republican colleagues used to talk a lot about. Home rule, the ability for localities and people to elect a representative to a body and those representatives to do something. If you have a problem with local D.C. laws, pick up a damn clipboard, go and knock some doors, and try to change it in D.C. But to do it from this institution, I think is shameful. Thank you. Yield back.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to remind my colleague on the other side of the aisle, U.S. Congress has a constitutional role to oversee Washington, D.C. law and intervene as necessary. D.C.'s non-citizen voting law is a dangerous policy. Only American citizens should be permitted to vote in this country, especially right here in the nation's capital city. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation to prohibit those who are not citizens of the United States from voting in elections in the District of Columbia. I yield back the balance of my time.
All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to